It was a sunny Saturday morning, the kind that begged for leisurely walks in the park or brunch at the new cafe in town. Wendy stood by the counter, absent-mindedly stirring sugar into her coffee. Her thoughts were far away, lost in the echoes of last night's argument. She and Roger had fought again. It was becoming a routine, a toxic cycle they couldn't seem to break. They were no longer the couple that laughed over silly jokes or shared whispered secrets in the dead of night. Now, their conversations were filled with tension and thinly veiled resentment. Somewhere along the line, they had drifted apart, and Wendy had found comfort in someone else. As she stood there, the memories of last night played in her mind like a broken record. Roger had come home late, his mood dark and brooding. She had tried to talk to him, to bridge the growing chasm between them, but it had quickly devolved into yet another argument. They had hurled accusations at each other, their voices rising until the neighbors could probably hear every word. But beneath the anger, Wendy had felt a deep, gnawing sadness. This wasn't what she had signed up for when she married Roger. This wasn't the life she had envisioned. The buzzing of her phone on the counter snapped her back to the present. She glanced at the screen and felt a thrill shoot through her as she saw the name, Jason, her lover, the man who made her feel alive again, who had become her escape from the cold, loveless marriage she was trapped in. She quickly picked up the phone and read the message. Morning, beautiful. Can't stop thinking about our wild last night. When can I see you again? A smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she typed back, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Soon, I promise. Roger's being a pain as usual, but I'll find a way. As she hit send, she felt a pang of guilt. This secret life she was leading with Jason was thrilling, yes, but it was also eating away at her conscience. Still, she couldn't bring herself to end it. Jason made her feel wanted, desired, something she hadn't felt in a long time with Roger. Just as she slipped her phone into her pocket, Roger entered the kitchen. His presence filled the room, tall and broad-shouldered, with that quiet intensity that had once drawn her to him. His dark hair was tousled, and the stubble on his jawline gave him a rugged, almost menacing look. He leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. "Who are you texting?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge that made her bristle. Wendy felt her heart skip a beat, but she quickly composed herself. "Just a friend," she lied smoothly, not missing a beat. She turned away from him, reaching for her coffee cup, hoping he wouldn't press further. Roger's eyes never left her. He was quiet for a moment, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Wendy could feel his gaze burning into her back, and it took everything in her not to turn around and meet his eyes. "Do we have to do this every morning, Roger?" she asked, her tone exasperated as she finally turned to face him. She took a sip of her coffee, using the moment to steady her nerves. He didn't respond immediately, just kept staring at her, those piercing blue eyes seeming to look right through her. Wendy felt a shiver run down her spine, but quickly shook it off. She had grown used to this tension, the undercurrent of suspicion that had become the new normal in their home. But it still unnerved her how he could stand there, so calm on the surface, yet she knew there was a storm brewing beneath. "I'm heading out," she announced abruptly, setting her cup down and grabbing her keys from the table. She couldn't stand being in the same room with him any longer, not with the way he was looking at her. "Where are you going?" Roger's voice was low, almost a growl. "Just out," she replied curtly, not bothering to give him any more details. She knew he wouldn't be satisfied with that answer, but she didn't care. She needed to get away, needed to breathe. Roger didn't try to stop her, didn't even move as she walked past him towards the door. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, his silence more unnerving than any words he could have said. As Wendy stepped out into the crisp morning air, she took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to her like a second skin. She could feel Roger's eyes on her even now, could feel the weight of his suspicions pressing down on her. But she pushed it all aside, focusing instead on the thought of seeing Jason later. As she got into her car and started the engine, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She glanced back at the house, half expecting to see Roger watching her from the window. But the curtains remained still, and the house looked as it always did, quiet, unassuming. a facade for the turmoil brewing inside. With a sigh, Wendy drove away, leaving the tension behind her, but she knew it wouldn't be for long. The calm before the storm never lasted. Jason was waiting for her at their usual spot, a secluded cabin nestled deep within the woods on the outskirts of town. The cabin stood like a forgotten relic amidst the dense trees, its weathered wooden exterior blending into the natural surroundings. It was their sanctuary, a place where they could shed the burdens of their lives and exist in a bubble of their own making. As Wendy parked her car along the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, she felt the familiar mix of excitement and guilt bubble up within her. She stepped out of the car, the soft crunch of gravel beneath her feet as she made her way to the front door. The air was crisp with the scent of pine and earth. With each step, the weight of her life with Roger seemed to fall away, leaving only the anticipation of being in Jason's arms. The door creaked open before she even had a chance to knock, and there he was, standing in the doorway with that easy smile that always made her heart skip a beat. Jason was tall, with a lean build and a rugged handsomeness that contrasted sharply with Roger's more polished appearance. His brown hair was tousled, and his dark eyes sparkled with warmth as they locked onto hers. "Wendy," he breathed, pulling her inside with a gentle urgency. The moment the door closed behind them, he wrapped her in his arms, his lips finding hers in a deep, hungry kiss. Wendy melted into him, her fingers tangling in his hair as she kissed him back with equal fervor. Here, with Jason, the rest of the world faded away. The worries, the lies, the guilt, it all vanished in the heat of their embrace. "I've missed you," Jason murmured against her lips, his breath warm and tinged with the faint scent of coffee. "I've missed you too," Wendy whispered back, her voice barely audible as she nuzzled into the crook of his neck, inhaling the familiar scent of him, woodsy and masculine, a scent that had become her comfort in this twisted double life she was living. Jason pulled back slightly, his hands cupping her face as he looked into her eyes, his expression softening. "You look tired," he said, concern lacing his tone. "Is everything okay?" Wendy sighed, her smile fading as she nodded. "It's just Roger. Things are getting worse between us. Last night was bad." Jason's jaw tightened, his thumb brushing gently over her cheek. "You don't have to stay with him, sweetie. We can figure this out together." Wendy shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "It's not that simple, Jason. A divorce would be messy, and Roger, he won't let go easily. I need to be careful." Jason's eyes darkened, a flicker of frustration passing through them. "I hate seeing you like this, stuck in a life that makes you miserable. You deserve so much better." She reached up, pressing a finger to his lips to silence him. "I know, but we're here now. Let's not waste our time talking about him." Jason nodded, pulling her close again. They stayed like that for a long moment, just holding each other, as if drawing strength from their connection. Eventually, he led her to the worn leather couch that sat in front of the fireplace, the logs already crackling with a comforting warmth. They sat down, her body fitting perfectly against his as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. For the next few hours, they talked about everything and nothing: work, dreams, silly stories that made them laugh until their sides ached. Jason had a way of making her forget the troubles that waited for her outside these walls. He made her feel young, desired, and carefree, emotions that had become foreign to her in her marriage to Roger. As the afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, their conversation turned to more serious matters. Jason leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at her with a furrowed brow. "Wendy, we can't keep doing this forever," he said quietly. "Sneaking around, lying to everyone. It's taking a toll on you. I can see it." Wendy bit her lip, her heart heavy as she looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting the silver ring on her finger, her wedding ring. "I know," she admitted, "but the thought of leaving Roger, it's terrifying. What if he reacts badly? What if he tries to hurt me?" Jason reached out, taking her hands in his. "I would never let that happen," he said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "I'll protect you, no matter what. But you need to make a decision, sweetie. You can't keep living in this limbo." She looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes. I'm scared, Jason. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You are, he said, squeezing her hands gently. You're stronger than you think. But you have to believe in yourself, and you have to trust me. We can do this together. We can get rid of him, but only if you're ready. Wendy took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling heavily on her shoulders. She knew he was right. This affair, this escape from her reality, could only last so long. Eventually, she would have to face the consequences of her choices, and the longer she waited, the more complicated it would become. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the cabin, Wendy knew it was time to go. The hours they had stolen together had come to an end, and reality was waiting just outside the door. Jason held her close, his arms wrapped around her in a protective embrace. He's never going to let you go. You know that, right? Jason said, his voice serious, his breath tickling her ear. Wendy pulled back slightly, looking into his eyes, her jaw set in determination. He doesn't have a choice, she replied, her voice firm. I'm going to leave him. I just need more time. Jason kissed her again, softer this time, as if trying to memorize the feel of her lips. Be careful, sweetie. He's not the kind of man you want to cross. I will, she promised, her heart heavy as she reluctantly pulled away from him. I'll be careful. With one last lingering kiss, she left the cabin, the door creaking shut behind her as she stepped back into the cold, harsh reality of her life. That night, the drive back home felt longer than usual. Wendy's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about Jason, their future, and the conversation they'd had earlier in the cabin. The excitement that usually accompanied their meetings was now tinged with a growing sense of dread. As she pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of her home did little to soothe her nerves. She sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm the anxiety gnawing at her. Taking a deep breath, she finally got out and walked up to the front door, the night air cold against her flushed cheeks. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that was as thick as the silence hanging in the air. The house was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of the living room lamp casting shadows on the walls. Wendy's heart skipped a beat, her instincts telling her that something was off. She closed the door behind her, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were trying to delay whatever awaited her. Roger was sitting in the living room, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wasn't watching TV or reading like he usually did at this hour. Instead, he was just sitting there, staring ahead, his face partially obscured by the shadows. But even from where she stood, Wendy could see the tension in his body, the stiffness in his shoulders. A cold wave of fear washed over her. We need to talk, Roger said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. There was no warmth, no softness, just a cold, detached tone that sent a shiver down her spine. Wendy froze, her heart pounding in her chest. About what? She asked, her voice wavering despite her best efforts to keep it steady. She set her bag down on the table by the door, her fingers trembling slightly. Roger stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he were trying to contain the storm brewing inside him. He was tall, with a commanding presence that had always made Wendy feel safe, but now that same presence felt menacing. He turned to face her, his eyes locking onto hers with a gaze so cold and piercing that it made her want to shrink back. About us, he said, taking a step closer. About you. Wendy's breath caught in her throat. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't ready for it. She had been so careful, so sure that Roger would never suspect anything. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw a darkness there, a deep well of anger and betrayal. I know you've been seeing someone else, he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it, a barely restrained fury that sent a jolt of fear through her. Her blood ran cold. What are you talking about? She asked, trying to sound confused, but her voice betrayed her, trembling slightly. Don't lie to me, Wendy, Roger snapped, his voice rising slightly. I'm not an idiot. I've seen the messages. I've followed you. I know everything. Panic surged through her, a cold, suffocating wave that made her feel dizzy. She had been so careful, covering her tracks, deleting messages, and being cautious about where she met Jason. But now, standing in front of Roger, she realized how naive she had been. The man she had underestimated was now staring her down with the fury of a betrayed lover. Roger, she started, her mind racing for an explanation, an excuse, anything to diffuse the situation. No, he cut her off, his voice harsh and unforgiving. I don't want to hear your excuses. I want the truth. For a moment, Wendy considered denying everything, spinning another web of lies to cover her tracks. But she could see it in his eyes he was done playing games. There was no use pretending anymore. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Fine, she spat, her voice sharp and defiant. She crossed her arms over her chest, a feeble attempt to protect herself from the vulnerability she felt. Yes, I've been seeing someone else. And you know what? I don't regret it. You've been impossible to live with, Roger. You've driven me to this. His face twisted with anger, his eyes narrowing into dark slits. But there was something else there too, something darker that she couldn't quite place, something that made her skin crawl. You think you're clever, don't you? Roger said, his voice low and menacing. He took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. You think you can just waltz out of this marriage and into his arms? Wendy's heart pounded in her chest, fear clawing at her insides. She tried to stand her ground, lifting her chin defiantly. I'm not staying here, Roger. I'm leaving you. He laughed then, a bitter, humorless sound that echoed through the room. You're not going anywhere, Wendy. Not until I'm done with him. Her heart skipped a beat. The cold, flat tone in his voice terrified her more than the anger. There was a chilling certainty in his words that sent a wave of panic crashing over her. What do you mean? Dumbass, he will smash you like a bug, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, dread seeping into her every word. But Roger didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at her with those cold, calculating eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the silent house, leaving her standing there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The following day dawned the unease that gnawed at Wendy. She had hardly slept, her mind plagued by images of Roger's cold stare and the ominous tone in his voice. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the darkness in his expression, the silent threat he had left hanging in the air. She reached for her phone the moment she woke up, her fingers trembling as she dialed Jason's number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times, no answer. She hung up, tried again and again, but each time, the call went straight to voicemail. Jason, it's me. Call me back as soon as you get this, she said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. I need to talk to you. It's urgent. Wendy paced around the house, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had Roger confronted Jason? Had something happened to him? By noon, the silence was unbearable. She hesitated for a moment, then got out of the car, her footsteps quickening as she approached the front door. She knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the afternoon. There was no response. Just as she was about to leave, her phone rang. She nearly dropped it in her haste to answer, her heart leaping when she saw Jason's name on the screen. Jason, where are you? I've been trying to reach you all day, she said, her voice a mixture of relief and frustration. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then she heard his voice strained, panicked. Wendy, it's Roger. He's here. Her blood turned to ice. What? Where are you? I'm at my house, but his voice cut off abruptly, replaced by the cold silence of a dead line. Jason? Jason! Wendy screamed into the phone, but there was no response. The call had ended. Terror gripped her as she jumped back into her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she sped towards Jason's house, her thoughts a chaotic mix of fear and desperation. What was Roger doing there? What had he done to Jason? She pushed the car to its limits, the world outside a blur of color and noise as she raced against the clock. When she arrived, the front door was ajar, hanging slightly open as if someone had left in a hurry. Wendy's heart pounded in her ears as she approached the door, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. The house was eerily silent, the only sound her own ragged breathing. She stepped inside, her eyes darting around the darkened rooms, every shadow a potential threat. "Jason," she called out, her voice small and scared, but there was no answer. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as she moved through the house, the silence pressing down on her. The living room was the last place she checked, and when she saw him lying there on the floor, her breath caught in her throat. Jason's face was pale, bloodied, and bruised, his body twisted in a way that made her stomach churn. "Jason!" she gasped, rushing to his side, her hands shaking as she touched his shoulder. "Oh my God, what happened?" He groaned, his eyes fluttering open as he tried to focus on her. "Wendy, he did this." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked around, trying to piece together what had happened. The room was in disarray, furniture overturned. A lamp shattered on the floor, and in the corner, she saw it. The object that had been used to violate Jason, discarded on the floor like a twisted trophy. It was a metal rod, sharp and brutal, smeared with blood. Wendy felt her stomach turn, while rising in her throat as the horror of what had been done to Jason hit her. She had to get him help, but her mind was reeling, the shock of the scene rendering her almost incapable of coherent thought. She fumbled for her phone, her hands slick with sweat as she dialed 911, her voice cracking as she tried to speak. "Please, you have to help us. My friend has been attacked. He's hurt badly," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. As she gave the operator the address, the sound of sirens in the distance filled the air. She looked down at Jason, her heart breaking at the sight of him, so vulnerable and broken. "I'm so sorry, Jason," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should have known. I should have protected you." The sirens grew louder, and moments later, the police burst through the door, guns drawn, their voices loud and commanding as they assessed the situation. Wendy was pulled away from Jason, her screams echoing through the house as they tried to calm her down. She fought against their grip, her desperation to stay by his side overriding all else. "Please, help him. He needs help," she cried, but her words were drowned out by the chaos of the scene. All she could do was watch as the paramedics rushed to Jason's side, their voices urgent as they worked to stabilize him. In that moment, Wendy felt the full weight of what had happened, the consequences of her choices crashing down on her. She had thought she could keep her two worlds separate, but now they had collided in the most horrific way possible, leaving her with nothing but guilt, fear, and the haunting knowledge that she had brought this upon them. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room cast a cold, sterile glow over everything, making the white walls seem even more oppressive. Wendy sat in one of the stiff, plastic chairs, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor, her mind numb. The events of the past few hours played over and over in her head, like a nightmare she couldn't escape. She had been questioned by the police, but the details were a blur, lost in the haze of shock and disbelief that gripped her. All she could think about was Jason, lying in that hospital bed, fighting for his life. The image of him, battered and broken, haunted her, replaying in her mind's eye every time she blinked. She had never imagined that her affair, something that had once felt so thrilling and forbidden, could lead to something so horrific. The waiting room was a world unto itself, a liminal space where time seemed to stretch and bend, each minute dragging on for an eternity. Other people were scattered throughout the room, families huddled together, a man with his head in his hands, a young woman nervously tapping her foot, but to Wendy, they were just shadows, background noise to the all-consuming dread that filled her. The door to the waiting room swung open, and Wendy's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. A doctor in a white coat approached her, his expression grim, the lines of fatigue etched deeply into his face. He looked at her with a kind of weary compassion that made her stomach drop. "Are you Wendy?" he asked gently, though there was a firmness in his tone that suggested he had done this countless times before. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She stood up, her legs feeling like they might give out beneath her. "I'm Dr. Roberts," he said, glancing down at the clipboard in his hand. "I'm overseeing Jason's care." Wendy nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She could barely hear her own thoughts over the deafening roar of her blood rushing through her ears. "How is he?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Roberts hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "He's in critical condition," he said finally, his tone serious but calm. "We've managed to stabilize him, but his injuries are severe. He lost a lot of blood, and there's significant internal damage. We're doing everything we can, but it's going to be a long road." Wendy nodded again, her eyes welling with tears. The doctor's words washed over her like a cold wave, numbing her to the core. She felt like she was drowning, each breath a struggle against the overwhelming tide of guilt and fear. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice breaking. Dr. Roberts looked at her with sympathy. "He's in the ICU. Right now, he's sedated and on a ventilator. We need to monitor him closely for the next 24 hours. You can see him, but only for a few minutes." Wendy swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded and led her down a long, sterile corridor to the intensive care unit. The sound of her footsteps echoed off the walls, each step bringing her closer to the reality she wasn't ready to face. When they reached the ICU, Dr. Roberts gestured to a door at the end of the hall. "He's in there," he said softly. "Take your time, but remember, he needs rest." Wendy nodded, her stomach churning as she approached the door. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle, before finally pushing it open. The room was dimly lit, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound. Jason lay in the bed, his body almost unrecognizable beneath the bandages and tubes. His face was pale, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. He looked so fragile, so vulnerable, that it broke something inside her. "Jason," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. She moved closer, reaching out to gently touch his hand. His skin was cold, and the contact sent a shiver through her. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "This is all my fault. I never should have. I never meant for any of this to happen." The guilt was suffocating, a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had thought she could control the situation, that she could have her affair and keep it separate from the rest of her life. But she had been wrong, terribly, tragically wrong. As she stood there, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The man she had once loved, the man who had been her husband, had turned into something unrecognizable, a monster capable of unspeakable violence. And the price of her infidelity, of her lies and deception, had been paid in blood. Jason's blood. She stayed by Jason's side for as long as she could, holding his hand, whispering apologies and prayers, but it was clear that he was far beyond hearing her. The machines kept him alive, but the man she had fallen in love with was trapped somewhere beyond her reach. Eventually, a nurse came in and gently told her that visiting hours were over. Wendy nodded numbly, reluctantly letting go of Jason's hand. As she walked out of the room, the weight of what she had done settled heavily on her shoulders. Her life, once filled with excitement and passion, had been shattered in a matter of hours. The future she had dreamed of with Jason was now uncertain, a distant possibility overshadowed by the dark reality of the present. She had lost everything: her marriage, her lover, and her sense of self. As she walked back down the corridor, the sterile walls closing in around her, Wendy realized that nothing would ever be the same again. 2 days later, Wendy found herself summoned to the police station. She had anticipated this moment, knowing that the fragile lies she had built her life upon would eventually crumble. As she sat in the sterile, gray-walled interrogation room, facing the detectives, a strange sense of calm washed over her. Everything had already fallen apart. There was nothing left for her to lose. The lead detective, a middle-aged man with a stern face softened by the weight of his years in the force, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "Mrs. Anderson," he began, his voice steady but probing, "we've reviewed the evidence and spoken to your husband. He's confessed to attacking Jason, but he claims it was in self-defense." Wendy's hands clenched into fists on the table, anger flaring inside her like a wildfire. "Self-defense?" He brutally essayed Jason. How can he claim that? Her voice trembled with fury, each word laced with disbelief. The detective exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger woman who had been quietly observing. He claims Jason attacked him first, the detective continued, and he acted in the heat of the moment. That's a lie. Wendy spat, her voice rising with each word. Roger planned this. He knew about the affair, and he wanted to punish Jason. He didn't act in self-defense. He acted out of revenge. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The detective studied her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but cautious. We believe you, Mrs. Anderson, but without concrete evidence, it's going to be his word against yours. Wendy's mind raced. She knew Roger had always been meticulous, careful to cover his tracks, making sure no evidence could ever be traced back to him. But there had to be some piece of the puzzle that could expose him for the monster he had become. I'll testify, she said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. I'll tell the court everything. Roger's manipulation, his threats, everything. The detective nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. We'll do everything we can to make sure justice is served, but you need to be prepared for a long and difficult trial. This won't be easy. Wendy nodded, her resolve solidifying like iron. She had been a fool to think she could escape from Roger without consequences, but now she was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what it took. As she left the police station, the cold wind biting at her skin, Wendy felt an unexpected sense of relief. The truth was out, and there was no going back. She would fight for Jason, for the life they had dreamed of together, and for the justice that Roger deserved. But even as she steeled herself for the battle ahead, a gnawing ache remained in her heart. The scars of this ordeal would never fully heal. She knew that. The price of her betrayal had been steep, and the weight of it would be hers to bear for the rest of her life.